Dorian Matthews had been delivering packages in downtown Phoenix for nearly a decade. He knew every street, every alley, every service entrance. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most of all, he took pride in doing his job well. But not everyone saw it that way. At Whitmore & Klein, a high-end marketing firm with polished marble floors and gleaming glass walls, Dorian was a nobody. To them, he was just another delivery guy in a blue uniform, a passing shadow in the line of sight of busy, successful people. At first, he ignored the cold stares and indifferent nods from the receptionists as they took packages from him. But over time, he began to hear snickers and whispered conversations as he walked by. Then one day, as he dropped a package off at the front desk, a voice cut through the office. "Can you imagine? If a delivery guy like him was our boss." The laughter broke out, sharp as invisible blades. Dorian didn't turn around, but he could feel the heat rising in his chest. The voice belonged to Ryan Caldwell, a senior account executive with a perfectly tailored suit and an ego bigger than the glass walls of his office. Another voice rang out, a girl's this time. "He's probably more used to carrying boxes than leading a meeting." The laughter grew louder. Dorian clenched his fists. He was used to the scorn, but there was something about this moment that he couldn't ignore. Not the words, but the certainty in their tone, as if they believed someone like him would never be able to hold his head up. He left the office without a word, but his mind was made up. Years later, the glass was still shiny, the marble floor still cool under hurried footsteps. But this time, when Dorian walked through the door, no one dared to laugh. The blue uniform had been replaced by a refined black suit. The sign in front of the reception desk had changed hands. Whitmore & Klein no longer belonged to the people who had laughed at him, it belonged to Dorian Matthews. When he entered the main conference room, familiar faces were waiting. Ryan Caldwell, the former account manager, sat there with a worried look. The girl who had mocked him also bowed her head, not daring to look straight. Dorian placed the documents on the table, his voice calm but sharp. "This is your notice of termination." Silence filled the room. No more laughter. No more disdainful smirks. There was only shame, regret, and the weight of belated justice. Dorian looked at them all and smiled. A triumphant smile. Dorian stepped out of Whitmore & Klein, the Arizona sun shining as bright as ever. He tipped his cap, ready to return to his truck, but then the reflection in the glass stopped him. His uniform was silver gray, his shoes frayed, the delivery scanner swinging from his waist. His hands were calloused, the marks of years of lifting heavy boxes. He was used to the way people looked at him, like part of the uniform, an anonymous figure in the big city. But today, for the first time in a long time, it made him uncomfortable. He couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the look Whitmore & Klein were giving him, the smug smirk in their eyes. It wasn't like he hadn't seen those looks before. But something about this moment stuck in his mind. Like a small piece of metal, sharp and cold, digging deeper every time he thought about it. Dorian climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut with more force than he usually did. He sat still for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't angry. The anger was fleeting, leaving a heavier feeling, a lingering question in his mind. They thought they knew who he was. But they didn't. Soon, they would. That evening, after finishing his last delivery, Dorian parked in front of his small apartment in Mesa. One bedroom, old carpet, kitchen with faded cabinets. Nothing special, but his. He sat in the dark, watching the light from the streetlight outside filter in through the curtains. Part of him wanted to forget about the morning, as he always did. But tonight was different. The logic he'd always told himself, that it didn't matter what people thought, as long as he worked hard and made an honest living, was suddenly not strong enough to dispel the thoughts in his head. Whitmore & Klein's laughter still echoed. Not just mockery, but certainty. They truly believed they were better than him. Dorian reached for the phone, dialing the only person who truly understood him. Malcolm picked up after 2 rings. "How are you?" Dorian took a deep breath. "I'm fine. How about you?" Dorian hesitated for a second. "Just, a bad day." Malcolm chuckled. "Let me guess. Some rich guy makes you feel like you don't belong." Dorian sneered, rubbing his forehead. "Almost. Nothing new." "Not new, but today is different." Dorian didn't answer. Malcolm always knew. His brother didn't press him, just waited quietly. They laughed, Dorian said, his voice low. As if the idea that you could be anything more than a delivery man was funny. There was a long pause. "And that makes you think?" Dorian closed his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, but Malcolm spoke before him. "It means I'm finally fed up." Dorian opened his eyes, staring at the dashboard in front of him. "What am I supposed to do? Quit for some idiot?" "No. But I'm smarter than that. Smarter than them." Dorian was speechless. For the first time in years, he began to wonder, if that were true, then why was he still here? Dorian gripped the steering wheel lightly, his eyes lingering on the old dashboard in front of him. The stack of delivery receipts lay there, a reminder of reality. But reality wasn't all he was. He knew that. Only people like Whitmore and Klein didn't. They saw him as a nobody, just a delivery guy. Their expensive suits, their arrogant smiles, were like knives cutting into his pride. But Dorian didn't need their approval. He just needed to prove himself. He remembered his younger days, when he was 16. Unlike other kids his age who spent their allowance on games or meaningless hobbies, Dorian had a strategy. He bought and sold limited edition sneakers, made a few $100s and turned it into thousands. People thought it was luck, but it wasn't. It was calculation, an understanding of the market, of supply and demand. When he was 20, he moved on to cars. Buying and selling used cars, learning how to negotiate, how to evaluate a deal before anyone else did. It wasn't just a job, it was an art, and Dorian was a natural artist. But his dream was bigger. He didn't just want to flip cars, flip shoes. He wanted to invest. He wanted to control. And he did. Stocks, small businesses, even real estate, Dorian threw himself into it all. No fuss, no bragging, just watching, learning, and doing. He knew how to read the market, how to see opportunities that others missed. And now, the biggest opportunity of his life had come. A business proposal. An opportunity he had spent years preparing for. Serious investors were listening to him, not because of his background, not because of the delivery job he did every day, but because of his intelligence. They saw what Whitmore and Klein never saw, a strategic mind, someone who could turn numbers into opportunities, a true businessman. "Dorian, what are you going to do?" Malcolm asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Dorian sighed, his eyes more determined than ever. "I'm going to prove them wrong." Dorian leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze scanning the silent room. Gone were the doubts and the wary meetings. They were ready to back him. The late nights in front of glowing screens, the long Zoom calls after grueling shifts, it had all led to this moment. He had quietly turned around 2 struggling businesses, without fanfare, without fuss. And now, those who had underestimated him would witness the inevitable. This evening, Dorian sat across from Anthony Wells, his lead investor, in a private lounge at a downtown hotel. The room had the air of a big deal, dim lighting, polished leather chairs, low conversations between powerful people over expensive whiskeys. Wells took a sip of espresso, his eyes never leaving Dorian. "Tell me again, why Whitmore and Klein?" Dorian leaned forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Because they're in trouble. And they don't even realize how bad it is." Wells raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Dorian pulled out a file, opening it in front of him. They're losing clients at an alarming rate. Poor leadership, outdated strategy, misplaced spending. They look successful on the surface, but the debt burden is strangling them. I'm giving them 6 months before they have to downsize or sell. Wells flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning the numbers. Are you sure about this? I've been following them for a while. Their biggest accounts are pulling out, their retention rates are plummeting. They live on reputation, not results. And it's coming back to haunt them. Wells chuckled, setting the file down. So you want to buy them? Dorian didn't blink. I don't just want to buy them. I want to restructure, cut the load, bring in new talent. Turn them into a real money-making machine. Wells leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table. A bold move. Dorian smiled. A smart move. Wells laughed, an amused laugh. I like your confidence. He took another sip of espresso, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a check. Silently, he slid it across the table. Dorian looked down. The exact amount he needed to make his first move. You have my backing. Don't make me regret it. He lifted the check, feeling the weight of the moment. The people who had mocked him had no idea, they were mocking their future boss. And soon, they would learn that the hard way. Patience was key. Buying a company isn't like buying a car or trading stocks. It requires strategy, timing, and knowing when to strike. He'd spent months studying Whitmore and Klein's finances, tracking their every mistake. They weren't just struggling, they were sinking. But they still had a nice office. Dorian smiled a little. It would be his office soon. Whitmore and Klein had long been a symbol of marketing success, a well-oiled machine with multi-million-dollar contracts and a powerful client list. But beneath the surface, its foundations were crumbling. Its biggest client was cutting its budget, operating costs were spiraling out of control, and the board, carried away by its own dreams, had no idea what to do to save the company. Dorian Matthews had long since noticed this. Rumors had begun to circulate in the industry, of layoffs, restructuring, of a sinking ship with no captain at the helm. Some employees sensed something was amiss, looking around nervously. Others still believed Whitmore and Klein was untouchable. But Dorian knew the truth. With the backing of Wells and other strategic investors, he began to make his first moves, quietly but ruthlessly. The first step, taking control of the company. Whitmore and Klein wasn't a public company, but it had a slew of shareholders, former executives, private investors, people who'd put money in years ago and now just wanted to get out before it all went bust. Dorian approached each one, making them offers they couldn't refuse. Some were skeptical, a former delivery guy trying to buy the whole thing. But money had its way, and one by one, they signed the transfer papers. There were long, late-night negotiations, secret agreements, hesitant signatures. But when the paperwork was done, Dorian had control of Whitmore and Klein. The final step, taking down Richard Langford. Langford was no genius. He'd built his career on connections and luck. But luck runs out eventually. Dorian didn't beat around the bush. He emailed Langford's assistant, Ellen, who'd worked at Whitmore and Klein for more than 2 decades. When she saw Dorian Matthews's name in her inbox, she blinked in confusion. "Sir, I just received an urgent email from Dorian Matthews." Langford didn't look up. "You mean, the delivery guy?" He laughed, a dry sound. What could he possibly want? "He's asking for an immediate meeting." Langford leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The earnings report looked terrible, the biggest client had just cancelled, and now some unknown person wanted to meet. It was ridiculous. He waved his hand. "Okay, let him in. Let's end this joke." But when Dorian walked into the office that morning, everything had changed. In the hallways, employees were whispering. Eyes were passing suspiciously. The receptionist, who had barely recognized Dorian for years, now looked at him warily. Dorian smiled. Today, he was no longer the delivery guy. Dorian entered the office, so quiet he could hear the second hand on the antique clock ticking away. Langford sat there, suddenly straightening up when he saw him, his eyes flashing with annoyance and suspicion. It was clear he had not been expecting this meeting. Langford didn't bother to stand when Dorian arrived, just glanced over with a questioning gaze. "What's this about?" he asked, but he didn't take his eyes off the computer screen, as if Dorian were some petty nuisance. Dorian didn't answer right away. He walked over to the desk, slowly setting a thick envelope down. The small sound of paper hitting wood carried an odd weight in the tense atmosphere. "It's about what happened this morning," Dorian said, his voice calm but sharp. Langford frowned, finally looking at him. "What the hell is this?" "I own most of Whitmore and Klein." The simple statement carried the weight of a hammer. Langford stiffened, then let out a sneer. "That's impossible." Dorian's expression remained the same. "Check the papers." Hesitation settled on Langford's face for a moment, but then he took the envelope, pulling out the documents one by one. As his eyes scanned the numbers, the signatures, the official stamps, the color drained from his face. His lips moved, then tightened. "Is this a joke?" he muttered, but his voice lacked certainty. Dorian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I thought I was your new boss." Langford slammed the stack of papers down on the table. "This company isn't for sale. You just don't know that." Langford's mouth opened and closed, his eyes darting frantically over the documents as if searching for some mistake. But there was no mistake. Everything was legal. Everything was settled. Dorian stood up, slowly, his face expressionless. "I'll give you until the end of the day to clean up your office." Langford glared at him, but said nothing. The silence was more bitter than any protest. Dorian turned and walked toward the door. As he put his hand on the knob, he paused, glanced over his shoulder, a thin smile playing across his lips. "Oh, and Richard." He paused for a beat, his eyes sharp as knives. "Don't worry. I'm sure there's a delivery job for you somewhere." Langford flushed, his teeth clenched. But he still couldn't get a word out. As Dorian walked out of the office, the door slammed behind him, echoing heavily through the building. The whispers began to spread. The staff glanced at each other, bewildered and curious. They had seen Dorian 100 times before, but never like this. Gone was the familiar uniform. Gone was the scanner strapped to his belt. There was only a confident presence, an unmistakable presence, a man in charge. Some recognized the files he had brought into the CEO's office. As the truth spread, a few even rose from their desks, trying to piece together what had just happened. Dorian paid no attention. He had more important things to do. He turned to Ellen, Langford's longtime assistant. She stood there, watching him with an unreadable gaze. "I need the entire company in the main conference room," Dorian said, his voice calm but unafraid of protest. 10 minutes. Ellen hesitated. She had worked for Langford for years. But now, she realized, times had changed. She stood in front of her computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Dorian had told her to send the email immediately, but she couldn't help but glance toward the closed office door. The cracks in the company were becoming more apparent, and she knew that everything would change forever after this moment. Minutes later, Whitmore and Klein employees poured into the conference room with its shiny glass walls. They whispered to each other, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. In the corner of the room, Ryan Caldwell, a senior executive, smirked. He leaned toward his colleague and muttered, "What is this? A security meeting?" His friend next to him laughed. "They're probably firing the cleaning crew." But the laughter died quickly as Dorian walked to the front of the room. No one sat down. No one spoke. The silence stretched as Dorian scanned the crowd. Some were confused, some impatient, and a few, like Ryan, remained amused. Dorian finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting." A few exchanged glances, shifting restlessly on their feet. "This morning," he continued, "I officially became the largest shareholder of Whitmore and Klein." A wave of shock swept through the room. Someone chuckled, as if expecting a joke, but the joke never came. Ryan crossed his arms, sneering, "Are you kidding?" Dorian turned to look at him, his expression unchanged. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Ryan's smile froze as Dorian placed a thick stack of documents on the conference table. Financial reports, contracts, agreements that had been signed to get him to this position. He gestured to the pile of papers. "If anyone has any questions, feel free to look." No one moved. The truth hung heavy in the air, choking off any protest. This was no joke. This was no mistake. Dorian Matthews, once ignored and ridiculed, was now their boss. For the first time since entering the building, Dorian allowed himself a moment of pause. He let them sit there, let them process the shock. Then he spoke again. "I've worked here for years. Most of you have never noticed me. Some have. And I know exactly what you think of me." His eyes flickered to Ryan. "I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone told me I didn't belong here." Ryan shifted slightly, but said nothing. "But I remember something else," Dorian continued. "I remember watching this company make mistake after mistake. I remember seeing potential wasted by leadership that refused to change. And I remember thinking that if I had the chance, I would do things differently." He took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "That chance is mine now." The tension in the room was palpable. The arms that were folded slowly relaxed. The people leaning against the walls straightened. No one dared to smile. Dorian stood firm, scanning each face. When he spoke again, each word was sharp and precise. "Things will change." Things were about to change. Some people wouldn't like it. Some wouldn't even be here to see it. Silence filled the room. Dorian gave them a moment to absorb that before continuing. "But for those of you willing to work, those of you willing to be part of something bigger, something better, you have a place here." His gaze swept the room again, slow and sure. Today wasn't yesterday. And it certainly wasn't the same company as when he'd walked in as a delivery man. He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued in a sharp tone that left no room for doubt. "If you don't like it, there's the door." The weight of his words fell on the room like a final judgment. And for the first time, they looked at Dorian Matthews as more than a lucky chancer to have landed in this position. No, he wasn't just passing through. He was here to stay. No one moved. No one spoke. The conference room seemed to be in a silent storm, waves of tension rising and falling. He saw it on their faces, the disbelief, the unease, the nervous glances they exchanged. People who had once felt invulnerable were now facing a new reality. Finally, Ryan Caldwell was the first to break the silence. He let out a short, hoarse, bitter laugh. He shook his head, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is crazy," Ryan muttered. "You can't be serious." Dorian turned to look at him, his gaze unwavering. "You think I'd be standing here saying all this if I wasn't serious?" Ryan breathed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "So you come in here, throw your power around, and we have to obey?" Dorian didn't blink. "No. You just do your job. If you can't handle it, you're free to leave." Ryan laughed derisively. "Since when did you become an expert at running a company like this?" Dorian took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "I know this company better than you think, Ryan. I've spent years watching you run it, seeing the arrogance, the wasted potential, the outdated strategies. And I've spent even more years learning how to run a successful business. Ryan clenched his jaw. You're making a mistake. No, Dorian replied calmly. The mistake is thinking I don't belong here. A few murmurs broke out. Some of the employees looked at each other, uncertain. The others, especially the lower-level employees who had been forgotten by the old management, looked at him with almost curious eyes. Dorian let the tension subside for a moment before continuing. Now, let's talk about the real mistakes. Dorian picked up the file on the desk and opened it, his gaze as sharp as a razor. Ryan, it seems you have a lot to say. Perhaps you want to explain why your department was responsible for one of the largest customer losses in the company's history. Ryan's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. That's not it. Dorian interrupted, his voice calm but murderous. I have the reports to prove it. He flipped open a page, his fingers running over the dry but undeniable numbers. Promises not delivered. Failure to adjust strategy as the market changed. You sent customers straight out the door, millions of dollars in revenue with them. Ryan's face flushed with anger and shame, but he couldn't argue. Dorian slammed the file shut, the sound echoing through the silent room. So if we're talking about who deserves to be here, I think you have more to answer for than I do. The air was thick. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, then he closed it. Numbers don't lie. Dorian took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the rest of the room. This is where some of you start to panic. This is where you wonder if you're going to lose your job. He let the words hang in the air, letting them sink in. And the answer is, some of you will lose your job. His voice didn't waver. He gestured to the pile of papers in front of him. I've done my research. I know who adds value to this company. I know who's been skating, who's been taking credit for other people's work. Several people sat up straight, their bodies tense. Worried glances swept over their colleagues, as if they were only now realizing the consequences of office politics. This company is carrying a heavy load, Dorian continued, his voice sharp as a knife. And I have no intention of carrying that burden. He paused, letting his words sink in. If you're here to work, to contribute, to help rebuild something stronger, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're here just to collect a paycheck and save face, he shrugged. You won't last long. The air in the room was thick. And then, Dorian delivered the final blow. I'll be serving my notice of termination by the end of the day. The room felt like it was starving. Some people took deep breaths, others froze like stone. Ryan stood up, took a step forward, his voice hoarse with anger. You can't just. I can. Dorian responded immediately, his eyes unwavering. And I will. Ryan clenched his jaw, his pride not allowing him to be the first to back down. He adjusted his tie, his chin held high, though his eyes were filled with anger. If this is how things go, I'll resign. Dorian stared at him, unblinking. It's the first good decision you've made in years. Ryan sneered, shook his head, then turned and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind him. A heavy silence fell. Dorian let the moment pass, letting everyone feel the weight of the situation, before speaking. For those of you still here, remember that Whitmore and Klein will not just survive. He looked around the room, his eyes shining with steely determination. It will become something better than ever. But only if the right people are in place. No one said anything. But in the eyes of some, Dorian saw what he needed to see, determination. And that was enough. Dorian's eyes moved around the room, taking in the reactions on everyone's faces. Some were nervous, some looked determined, some still confused, as if still trying to process what had just happened. He paused, his voice low but weighty. If you're willing to put in the work, to actually build something meaningful, you have a place here. Another pause, allowing his words to sink into the tension. But if you're only here because you think you deserve it, because you're comfortable, because you believe things won't change, he glanced toward the door. You can go with Ryan. The room was silent again. But it wasn't shock. This time, it was realization, an undeniable truth: things had changed. Dorian was no longer the man they dismissed. And from that moment on, he would never be the same again. As Dorian left the conference room, the atmosphere in the office seemed to have flipped. Some of the employees sat silently at their desks, still stunned. Others murmured, whispered to each other, furtive glances directed at him, the man they had ignored for so many years. Some looked frightened. Some looked curious. And only a few, very few, looked inspired. Dorian didn't let any of that get to him. He had done what needed to be done. Now the real work began. He walked into the room that had once belonged to Langford, now his. It was larger than he'd expected. Leather bookshelves were stacked with unopened business books. A large oak desk, probably more expensive than his first car. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. This moment should have been different. He had spent years, months working, fighting against prejudice, being fired, being underestimated. And he had done it. He had proved them wrong. But as he stood there, staring at the distant horizon, he realized, this wasn't about revenge. If that had been his motivation, the satisfaction would have come by now. He would have felt elated as he watched Ryan leave, as they, the people who had mocked him, had to face the fact that the man they had despised now owned everything they stood on. But that wasn't what drove him. He had done this because he knew he could build something better. Not just for himself, but for the forgotten people out there, the people who had been underestimated, cast aside, just like he had. There were people in this building with talent. People with ideas. People who, under the right leadership, could take this company to new heights. And there were people who no longer belonged here. Dorian had learned a hard lesson: respect was never given. It had to be earned. Earned. Built with actions, not words. A gentle knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Ellen, Langford's former assistant, entered hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Dorian turned from the window, nodding. "It's just getting started." Ellen stood on the small balcony of the building, her eyes scanning the city lights. A light breeze blew, stirring her hair. She smiled slightly. "I think it looks different from this side." Dorian watched her for a moment, his eyes sharp but unhurried. Ellen was different. She had been in the company long enough to see its boom, its regrettable mistakes, and its slow decline. "I have a question for you." He spoke, his voice calm. She turned, raising an eyebrow. "Okay. Why are you still here?" Ellen crossed her arms, her eyes slightly pensive. She knew she could leave, could find another opportunity. But then she sighed softly, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "Because I loved this place once. And I think, under the right leadership, it can be the same again." Dorian nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Ellen hesitated before continuing. "Honestly, I didn't expect this. I've seen a lot of CEOs come and go, but I never thought I'd see this company in your hands." Dorian let out a small laugh, a short but not exactly happy one. She couldn't help but chuckle, shaking her head. "Langford's gone, Ryan's gone. There's too much uncertainty right now." "There's always change when that happens," he said, his voice unwavering. Ellen studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The way I see it, this place needs a little change." Dorian chuckled. "Let's get to work." As she walked out of the office, he turned back to look out the large window. The city continued to move, lights reflecting off the glass. It wasn't just Whitmore and Klein that was changing. It's not just his employees who are still adapting. He himself is changing. For the first time in his life, Dorian doesn't just want to prove that he's a leader. This time, he actually has a chance to do it. And this is just the beginning. The lesson is clear: never underestimate someone just because of where they're starting from. Because one day, they might be the ones who decide your future.